This week on London Real, we have the fashion designer, urban outlaw, and Porsche hunter, Magnus Walker.
People fall in love with bikes and cars and automotive stuff and planes at an early age because that's when you start dreaming. Car represents freedom to go wherever you want to go, however you want to go. I didn't know what a TED Talk was, and to be honest, I'm not quite sure why I'm here today. The clothing, the filming, the buildings that we've owned, the property that we've managed, and the Porsches have all got their own unique style. We only design what we personally like to wear. We didn't follow a trend, we sort of made the trend.
London Real presents Magnus Walker, Porsche hunter.
Never say no to anything. Never really turn anything down. Or always be open to things that are slightly different, because you don't know where they're going to take you.
Our guest this week is known as the urban outlaw, and I personally first heard about Magnus from his TED Talk that he gave at UCLA, which is a fascinating 16 minutes on who he is, and he keeps repeating this expression, go with your gut, which really has been the story of his life, and it seems to have happened to him 3 different times. It started out when he moved to Los Angeles and created his own fashion brand called Sirius Clothing, and then it proceeded when he made a real estate investment in a studio workspace in kind of the bad part of downtown LA, which at the time wasn't cool, and that morphed into a space that he ended up renting out to a lot of television and Hollywood productions. And his latest stage of his life is becoming a Porsche hunter. And it's such a strange combination when you look at Magnus, because he kind of looks like a dreadlocked rock and roll, almost a homeless guy, and yet his passion is restoring 911 Porsches and has almost become the new face of Porsche, which is really kind of a fascinating juxtaposition, because this traditionally very staid German auto manufacturer has embraced, this tattooed, super cool dude. And it's almost the opposite of what you'd expect. You'd almost expect a Porsche owner to look like me, and be some ex-banker, gray-haired, guy in his 40s, and yet it's Magnus. And so I just find that fascinating. And we both agreed during this show it's something that probably wouldn't have happened 10 years ago, but he shot this documentary called Urban Outlaw that's just a wonderful look inside of Magnus and this beautiful studio he has. And you can see the time he really takes, to personalize each one of these automobiles. And I had a real connection with Magnus because I spent 2 years of my life in high school from 16 to 18 years old restoring my 1968 Ford Mustang with a 302 V8 automatic transmission, and I know everything about Ford Mustangs, from the original one in 64 and a half to the 65, 66, which have a different body style than the 67 and 68, and I used to come home with my fingers black from working on my car in the garage and in auto shop. I took an auto body class, and I used to drive 45 minutes each night, and I painted and restored my car completely from an auto body perspective. So I know what I'm talking about, and so I understand the passion that certain men have with restoring cars, and we really connected. Actually, Magnus thinks that Porsche owners and Ford Mustang owners have a lot in common, because each car, the 911 and the Mustang, are iconic pieces of each brand, which are Ford and Porsche. So it was nice to know that I was still in the club, even though my car cost me $1,200 that I saved up to buy when I was 16, and the Porsches are a bit more expensive, but we had a real bonding. So I think you're going to love Magnus. He's a really fascinating guy and has a lot of interesting things to say, and one of them really is go with your gut. And he's not a classically trained guy or a formally educated guy, but he obviously knows how to run a business and knows how to follow his passion. And great things happen when you follow your passion, and I say that a lot on London Real, and I really mean it. So big love to Magnus. I think you're really going to enjoy him a lot, and sit back and relax for that one. I want to give a big shout out to our homeboys, our supporters from a long time ago, and that is the folks at Bulletproof. If you're not familiar and you've never watched London Real before, you won't know that Bulletproof is a coffee that's free of molds and toxins. You mix it up with some grass-fed butter, and boom, that's my breakfast. That's my lifeblood. I swear by it. I dream by it. If you want to know more about Dave, you can watch our blogs, which he's posting about the Bulletproof Diet, which is a fantastic book, and you can check it out and get a copy of that now. So please do, and also some more exciting exciting things coming from them later this year. And finally, I want to give a shout out to the folks at Squarespace. They are the ones that make us look beautiful. I always say you only get one chance to make a first impression, and online, that is your website. The guys at Squarespace, it's perfect. It's drag and drop. It's so easy to build your site. Even my better half has her site at mygourmetjournal.com. So please check that out. You can use the code London for 10% off if you do choose to buy. And big thanks for them for keeping these free and keeping us rolling and rocking and everything wonderful. So fantastic. We've just streamed live our very first London Reel episode to all the folks at London Reel Academy, and it was just greatly received. It was a lot of fun to have that live energy in the room with Mr. Joe Cross, Joe the Juicer. So big love to those guys, and thank you guys so much for your support. And now, without any further ado, I'm going to leave you with the one and only, the urban outlaw, Mr. Magnus Walker. This is London Reel. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Magnus Walker, who is the creator of the fashion label Serious Clothing and one of the most prolific Porsche collectors in the world. Or you might know him as the bearded, dreadlock, tattooed, rock and roll, urban outlaw Porsche hunter. How's that? That's pretty good,
quite a
right?
mouthful, but you've obviously done a little bit of homework because I didn't provide you with any of that info, but that's a great intro. Thank you.
That was all me. You shot to fame in 2012 with a 32-minute documentary titled Urban Outlaw, followed by more videos with you and Porsches and your recent TED Talk that's had over 1 million views. Magnus, welcome to London Reel.
Great to be here. It's, you're in this uber trendy part of town, so I've been exploring the neighborhood, and it's got a good vibe. So thanks for the opportunity, and I'm glad to be here.
No, it's going to be a lot of fun. You know, it's funny because I'm an American in East London who looks like he's from L.A., and you're an Englishman who lives in L.A. who looks like he's from East London.
Are you reading that off a script there?
Yeah, I wrote that earlier.
Oh, you wrote that? Okay.
You like that?
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good.
Is that a fair representation, or
you have to repeat it. I was paying no attention. I was just amazed that you read it.
Because I was thinking about the
You're an American in L.A.
Yeah, I'm an American who looks like he's from L.A. who's in East London.
Right.
You're an Englishman who lives in L.A. who looks like he should live in Shoreditch. So is that a...
Yeah, it's a pretty good assumption. I mean, I often feel like I'm a visitor or a tourist in my own country because, truth be told, I grew up in Sheffield, but I left Sheffield as a 19-year-old in 1986. So I've been in America almost 30 years. So as much as I love England, I often joke that it's a great place to visit. Growing up in Sheffield in the late 70s, early 80s, I seldom visited London. So London, it's interesting, back then people didn't really travel. You sort of, a trip to London was something you planned. It wasn't like you just got on a train or got in the car and went there. So it's good to be here, but yeah, I agree. I feel a little bit like a tourist in my own country.
What's the big difference you notice when you come here from LA that London or England feels different than, say, LA?
Well, the main difference, I think, London is obviously a lot more cosmopolitan. That's one thing.
Than LA?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a spectacular walking city.
Right.
There's a song, Nobody Walks in LA. I mean, just because it's so spread out. So for me, I love, whenever I come to London, I'm always on some sort of odd jet lag where you wake up at 3 a.m. in the morning. So generally, I love to get up around that time, 4 o'clock, and go walk around. Just the amount of people you see on the street, it's a whole cross-section of life. One time I was down on the south side of the river, Tate Modern area, Borough Market, I love it down there.
Yeah, it's nice.
Cab driver pulls up, and there's so many great things about London. London cab drivers are one. I guess it must have been a Friday or Saturday morning, and the guy goes, "You been on the razzle or something?" Thought I'd been, literally out all night long, whereas in reality I'd just flown in and was jet lagged and walking around. So to me, London is just a real cosmopolitan city that is inspirational. I was walking around yesterday. I'm not too familiar with this area. Normally I'm sort of more Covent Garden area. My wife likes to stay there at the St. Martin's Lane. So I joked earlier on that we're not hip enough to be in Shoreditch. I've made it to Brick Lane a few times before because being English, obviously I do love curry. But the point to my story, the long answer to your question is, just even yesterday I'm walking around, I got out the iPhone, there's just so much visual inspiration, whether it's street art or graffiti or just old buildings in various states of either sort of commercialization or buildings that are decayed but have just got great character, soul and patina, and just the people, you see walking around, the diversity from one neighborhood to the other in a short period of time.
Right.
You don't see that in LA because nobody walks in LA,
Because you're known for driving cars, you're very well known for that, but yet you're walking when you're here, so.
Well, yeah, that's my running joke also. I just came from a garage in Watford with some buddies and we're talking about electric cars, and one of the guys was from Norway, and in Norway there's a lot of electric cars, especially Teslas, because there's no tax, and so those cars are tax-free, pay no sales tax. And I'm talking about, well, I've got a low carbon footprint because I got a garage full of 40, 50-year-old Porsches, but I actually walk to work. So I'm one of the few people in LA that actually walks, and we live in the Arts District in downtown LA, which in a sense is similar to this neighborhood in the sense that 10 years ago it was a no-go zone. Former sort of industrial, transient, desolate neighborhood that now is going through mass gentrification. I'm talking a couple of thousand condo lofts in former industrial buildings that were converted. And now the new trend is those buildings have sort of been bought up and already converted. People are now doing ground-up construction. So mass residential coming in, and then what follows residential obviously is commercial. So trendy coffee shops, gourmet restaurants, yoga studios, CrossFit gyms. Literally next door to our building is a 7,500 square foot restaurant that just opened up. Across the road is a hipster coffee house. Next door to them, it looks like someone's opening up their own bourbon distillery. So this is all going on in the Arts District in LA, which is newer and smaller than Shoreditch, but shares quite a lot of what I'm seeing has already happened here, gentrification.
Right. I want to talk about that space that you converted, I think in 2000, 2001. It was in your documentary. I know you have your garage there. But I wondered if you could take us back to almost 40 years ago when I guess you would have made a trip from Sheffield down to London, 1977, Earl's Court for the motor show. I think you had a big moment there. I was just wondering, do you remember what London was like then? And do you remember what that looked like then?
I don't remember London. I remember the moment, the Earl's Court Motor Show. I remember my dad and myself came down on a coach. I grew up working class, Northern England. Dad was a salesman. So we didn't grow up with wealth. So I remember we took a coach down to London, and then I guess we must have took a train to Earl's Court where the motor show was. And as a kid, I had that Porsche poster on the wall, played those top trumps, playing supercar cards. So I don't remember London when I was 10 years old, but I do remember that London Earl's Court Motor Show, because that was what has become a very pivotal moment for me. At the time, as a 10-year-old, it was just, hey, that's an awesome car at a car show type of thing. I didn't realize the impact that it would have on my life, because that impact didn't happen for almost 35 years later. You mentioned earlier on about the film Urban Outlaw, the 32-minute documentary, which my Canadian beardo brother, as I like to call him, Timur Moscovici, took a leap of faith. For those that are watching, we shot Urban Outlaw on 2 cameras, and I think here we have 6. But he asked one pretty interesting question in that film. At the time, I really didn't think about it, but he said, what do you think Porsche would think about what you've done to their cars? And I said something like, I hope they'd be smiling. And within 3 months of that film coming out, which changed my life, and we can talk about that in a bit more detail, but within 3 months of the film coming out, I actually received a letter from Porsche. Because as a 10-year-old, after I went to the London Earl's Court Motor Show, I did write a letter to Porsche. Apparently that's quite a familiar story, because I've received thousands of emails in the past 2.5 years, and it seemed to be a common thread of people writing to their favorite car company.
When they were young.
When they were young. And back then in the 70s, Porsche was a smaller company, just like most automobile companies were. And they obviously had a PR press department that sent letters back to kids like me and sent them a brochure, and the seed was sown there at an early age. And that's a common story. I think people fall in love with bikes and cars and automotive stuff and planes as an early age, because that's when you start dreaming. What do you want to be? Race car driver, fireman, astronaut, fighter pilot. Those early moments, maybe we don't realize at the time, but those turn out to be life-changing moments.
What do you think it is with boys and cars, or men and cars? Is it, I'm trying to think of what it is. I'm not necessarily a car guy, but now that I've read about your story, I had my 68 Mustang when I was in high school, and I was all over that thing when I was 16 to 18. And so is it something about the body of the car and the female figure, or is it the fact that as men, we're not encouraged to be creative, and we can be creative with our cars? Have you ever thought about what the attraction is?
I think it's everything. I think, there's a lot of different equations as to that answer to that question. One is freedom. To me, my story, I fell in love with Porsche as a 10-year-old, but I didn't buy my first Porsche until I was 22. I bought my first car a few years earlier, which was a 1977 Toyota Corolla 2TC that I bought for $200. When I lived in Sheffield, I was there till I was 19, but all my adult responsibility was really in the States. When I was living in Sheffield, I was at home on the dole, living at my mum and dad's house, doing odd jobs. So there was no real sense of freedom there. It was sort of in this channel of going nowhere fast. So when I bought my first car several years later, once I'd been in LA for a few years, instantly represented freedom. But to backtrack to a 10-year-old when I didn't know what freedom was, it just looked cool and fast. You know, the shapes, intoxicating. So I see friends that have kids. Kids are 3, 4, 5 years old. I give them toy models and they just like whizzing them around on the floor, on the tabletop. It just seems a natural thing for boys to play with cars when you're young.
Yeah.
And you either grow out of it or you don't. And I think a lot of people never grow out of that.
Yeah, the freedom issue is big because when I was 16, you get your license in the States at 16, and the car meant so much of freedom. It meant you didn't have to do what your parents said, and meant you could do all those things. People say today that the internet is now people's freedom because now they can associate with their friends, and you don't necessarily have to get to places.
Yeah, the internet's different, though, because you never leave your home.
Right.
The car, you actually go out there and experience stuff in the real world as opposed to the virtual world.
Right.
And for me, I never had a car in England, never had a car in Sheffield, never even had a driver's license. So as a kid, my father watched motorsports. I vividly remember watching F1 in the 70s. Mid-70s in England was a glory era, 76, 77. It's documented in the film Rush. We had James Hunt, 1976 world champion on 4 wheels, Formula One wheels. So I had Barry Sheen, 2-wheel world champion.
So you remember that in your childhood?
I remember that era. I mean, you've got to remember England is an automotive country. Yeah, Detroit's an automotive legendary city, and the Ford Motor Company and Henry Ford and the Model T. The birth of it was in the States, but you got to remember England had a thriving car industry in the 50s and 60s. I mean, all these just iconic cars that are not Porsche 911s, a lot of them were English cars. The Austin Mini Cooper, E-Type Jag, Aston Martin DB5. So as a kid, you grow up, you watch James Bond. James Bond's driving an Aston Martin. There's a lot of visual exposure and stimulation to the automobile. I remember watching James Bond driving the Aston Martin. I remember watching a show called The Persuaders, where it was Roger Moore and Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis was driving a Ferrari Dino. I remember watching Dukes of Hazzard, where they're driving a Dodge Charger, the American muscle car. Yeah. Steve McQueen driving the 68 Mustang in Bullet.
Bullet, yeah.
So as a kid growing up anywhere in the world, I mean, my story was Porsche, but the influences are out there if you just turn on the TV. And I used to watch a lot of motorsport. Occasionally we'd go to racetracks such as Donington and Mallory Park and Cadwell Park and watch amateur club racing. Even though we didn't have much money, my dad was pretty mechanical and would work on his buddies' cars and stuff like that. So I was exposed to the car at an early age, and it never really went away.
Right. Talk to me about America. You always say that it was the land of opportunity. And when you say it in that documentary, it sounds almost like a cliched expression, but you really mean that. And I was just wondering why it meant that for you.
Well, the backup, I left school at 15, fell in love with Porsche at 10, from like probably 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. I was doing a lot of cross-country, middle-distance running, and I was pretty motivated and relatively successful at it. And I'll touch on this story a little bit later on because I think that gave me a lot of drive as a young kid, which I still have that drive later in life. So that early teen period of achieving some level of success in a sport, which is an individual sport, cross-country running, I was not necessarily a team player. So I left school at 15 on the dole, as I said. But to answer your question of America and freedom, I realized that at an early age, I suppose 16, 17, I'd bummed around for a year. I went back to college and did this thing called Leisure and Recreation Sports Management course. It was sort of an easy thing to do for a year. But the pivotal part there was I heard of this thing called Camp America. And Camp America basically recruited people in Europe to go work on a summer camp in the States. And to me, it was like, wow, this is great. You're actually going to get paid a little bit of money to go spend the summer in America. So compared to Sheffield with sort of no opportunity, I jumped at that and got accepted onto a summer camp in Michigan. I didn't even really know where Michigan was. But America and freedom. So took the train from Sheffield down to London, Heathrow to New York, one night in New York, and then all gathered in a hotel. This is 1986, and the next day you're on a Trailways bus to the middle of nowhere, which turned out to be Detroit, or actually a summer camp on Lake Michigan, 40 minutes north of Detroit. And so that summer just represented complete freedom. So it was the first time I'd actually ever really been away from home for any great length of period. And that was just like being dropped into a different world. You know, the summer camp was, I was a camp counselor, so I'm looking after inner city kids from Detroit. You know, so it was sort of a rough environment. Now, Sheffield's a northern environment, sort of a little bit of a rough environment too, but I was like a fish out of water. You know, I'm a rock and roll, heavy metal kid surrounded by, at the time, everything's Run DMC, LL Cool J, and it's hip hop. So that was like diving in the deep end to this American culture. And to me, it was just, no one is ever really going to tell you, can't do this, can't do that. So my first sense of freedom was a road trip, which I call my first American great road trip. Stage one was New York to Detroit, 2-3 months on the summer camp in Detroit, and then Trailways bus from Detroit to LA. Now, I often joke about, you look at the map and Detroit to LA in a straight line doesn't go through Memphis, Tennessee, but the first experience back in '86 was 3 days on a Trailways bus going cross country. You meet a lot of interesting people. And I arrived at Union Station in LA at 5:30 in the morning, big duffel bag, and it was a bit of a shock because I'd watched tons of American TV, everything I just described, Chips, Rockford Files, and you just expect in Hollywood to be as you see it on TV. But Union Station at 5 a.m. in the morning 30 years ago is nothing like you see on TV, or it's some sort of down and out version of that. I didn't really know where I was going. I fell asleep on a bench and got rudely awoken at 6 a.m. by a cop who said I couldn't sleep here, and ended up going to a YMCA on Hollywood Boulevard. So that was my first sort of journey of, wow, what am I going to do? You know, I was only really planning on visiting LA for a couple of weeks, and I didn't know nobody.
And were you cool about this back then? Were you kind of, I'm going to take life as it goes? Or were you stressing it all at this age when you show up there and you don't know where to sleep? Do you remember what your mindset was like?
You're 19 years old. You think you can do anything. I mean, the sun's shining, everyone speaks English or American English, you know, so how bad could it be, really? I mean, it's an adventure. You're on this big adventure, and it's a challenge to see how you're going to survive. You know, I really didn't have much money in my pocket. I might have had a couple of $100. Staying at the YMCA for a couple of nights, and Hollywood Boulevard was there, and that sort of down and out, transient, homeless, scuzzy, punky. But to me, it was a perfect environment because it was the glory days of heavy metal. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, Motley Crue, Guns N' Roses, Whiskey A Go-Go, Sunset Strip. So I think within the first day or two, I'd visited one or two of the local heavy metal nightclubs, socialized with a few people. Back then, being English was sort of a bit of a novelty. Yeah. People were super friendly, super welcoming. You know, and that was where I sort of fell into my first taste of American entrepreneurial spirit. I don't know if you're familiar with the story I talk about, buying those PVC pants on Hollywood Boulevard. Yeah. So that was my glam rock days, pre-beard, Motley Crue, spiked hair. So I remember, I guess we must have got there like on a Friday or Saturday, and I literally bought a pair of pants, black snakeskin vinyl pants, on this retail store on Hollywood Boulevard for $9.99. And I asked around, where's the cool shopping street, and eventually found Melrose, which was sort of like the King's Road of LA back then. You know, a lot of those boutique independent stores were very King's Road-esque. And, you know, I went into this one store, Retail Slut. This is a familiar story that I've told, but I'll repeat it again. And there was a band called Faster Pussycat who was sort of a Guns N' Roses, Motley Crue type of band who hadn't quite made it to their level. And one of the guys, Tammy Downs, was working behind the counter and struck up a conversation, rock and roll type stuff, and commented on my pants. And I hadn't thought about selling them, but it literally was, I can almost remember it word for word, like it was so clear. Hey man, cool pants, where do you get them? And I didn't say Hollywood Boulevard. I said, oh, I got them in London, and just jokingly said, why do you want to buy some? And he said, yeah, how much are they? And I'm like, well, I'm not going to tell him I paid $9.99 for them. So first figure that cropped into my head was $25. He said, all right, I'll take 8 pairs. I want 130, 232s, 234s, and a 36. I went right back to Hollywood Boulevard. I guess I bought a dozen pants for $120 and went and sold him 8 for $200. And I was $80 ahead and still had 4 more pairs of pants that I later sold to someone else. And I was like, wow, maybe this LA thing's not so bad after all. I mean, you know, it was pretty comical. It was almost like, fuck, how could these people not know? But that's the division. Hollywood Boulevard wasn't trendy. Melrose was trendy. So it wouldn't have occurred to someone to go to a crappy type of clothing store on Melrose because that wasn't cool.
Did you have any fashion interest when you were in England?
Well, yeah, I did in a sense of if you count, making your jeans tight and sewing patches on your denim jacket that say Saxon and Motorhead and Rainbow and Deep Purple as fashion. I didn't see it as fashion, but my mum had an old tabletop Singer sewing machine and she used to make her own dresses and stuff like that. So I obviously learned to sew from watching my mum, and I'd buy old Levi's, and of course they were never tight enough, so you had to turn them inside out, put a seam down the leg, and all of a sudden they're tight. So it was pretty interesting because the part I don't generally tell about the $9.99 pants story is when I actually bought them, they weren't tight. I actually went to a CVS and bought a hand sewing kit and tuck them in by hand and made them tight. But of course, when I sold them to retail store, they were just buying they weren't wide leg version, but they weren't spray on spin tight version that I was wearing. So I'd actually made those pants, I'd adapted them pretty quickly.
Right, so serious clothing was born then, pretty much.
Nah, serious clothing didn't come till like 1991. This is 86.
Okay.
I actually went back to England probably 4 months later for a short period in 86. I overstayed my visa that first time, went from the YMCA to Venice Beach for a week and then back to Hollywood, met some friends. I was couch hopping for a couple of months. Went back to England probably November of 86, completely hated it. Applied for Camp America again and got turned down. I'm like, oh, fuck. I'd had a taste of freedom, but all of a sudden I'm back up north in grim Sheffield and depressed and just feel like I'm going nowhere fast. So reapplied to Camp America, got turned down and thought, oh, what am I going to do? And then another story I remember just like yesterday, on a Tuesday, I got a phone call from the Camp America administration staff saying, we found you a spot, can you leave on Friday? So literally with like 2-3 days notice, I was back in America with hardly any money on my pocket, but this time worked on a summer camp in New York. So this was great. The camp was actually in New Jersey, but same type of camp, underprivileged kids from Newark, New Jersey. So almost the same environment as the Detroit camp. But the great thing about Camp America Round 2 was 30 minutes outside Manhattan. So as great as Detroit was, in Detroit in 86, it was a thriving sort of punk rock music scene there, right, with a lot of cool underground clubs. And that was sort of the beginning of the great decay of Detroit, I suppose. And at the time, I didn't realize, upon reflection, what an impact Detroit had on the States, automotive industry. But Round 2 was New York, even cooler. Cool clubs, more sex, drugs, rock and roll type stuff. CBGBs, all that stuff,
Okay.
Went to a lot of clubs there, clubs that are scrap bars that are no longer even there, Lamar's in Brooklyn, stuff like that.
So that East Coast flavor probably later fed into some of your fashion, you think, probably?
Well, the fashion came by accident. I'll lead into the fashion. I went back out to LA in 86 and literally never went back. Bummed around in LA for a couple of years, going out to clubs and stuff like that. And back then, a little bit of money went a long way. The fashion thing happened by accident, really in around 1990. I got a job on the boardwalk in Venice, selling originally seconds from the Gap, T-shirts and crap like that, 2 days a week on a little stall. And I noticed there was a guy a couple of booths down, and Venice Beach back then was sort of a little bit like what Camden Market was like 10 years ago. It wasn't really commercialized. Lots of artisans doing lots of Grateful Dead, hippie type stuff, craft arts type things. I noticed this guy was selling old secondhand clothing, vintage stuff. So I started getting into secondhand clothing, going to yard sales, flea markets, Salvation Army, and buying Levi jeans. You'd pick them up for 50 cents, $1, $2.50. And I started putting patches on them because I sort of like that whole... I've always liked Americana. I often talk about Evel Knievel, Captain America, red, white, and blue. So I'd put like old red, white, and blue flags. I'd buy flags and cut them up and put patches on the jeans. And then I'd do this sort of buy old Western shirts, paisley florals, and patch them up. So it was sort of like on the rock and roll end of things, Black Crowes-esque rock and rolly. And then on the opposite end, it was right when the rave scene was starting to happen. And they were all into sort of patchwork jeans and overalls. And I remember someone came up to me, and there was a booth next door selling Guatemalan hats, like the traditional sort of Rasta Guatemalan Tams. And one guy said to me, could you make one of those like in velvet? I said, well, I never have, but I'll try. So I bought one, took it apart, copied the pattern, and instead of sewing it back up in Guatemalan type cloth, I sewed it up in red, white, and blue, or no, actually red, gold, and green Rasta colors. made a Rasta hat. But I did something just a little bit different. Instead of lining it like those guys always did with some black nylon cheap lining, I lined it in a solid velvet color and decided, oh, this thing's reversible. 2 sides, 2 hats for one. So then I started selling hats and the patchwork jeans. Sort of went together. Back then it was this sort of whole, Black Crowes is a pretty good reference to what that scene was like.
Right. Early 90s.
Early 90s, 70s inspired rock and roll music. The rave scene's coming in a little bit with all these English bands from Manchester, Happy Mondays and Spiral Carpets, trippy, hippy dippy looking stuff. And it was just a creative time. And I think someone asked me, you ever made a Cat in the Hat hat? I didn't even know what the Cat in the Hat was, but Dr. Zeus book, oh, it's got a bunch of stripes around it. So figured out how to make that. And before you know it, we had a little hat line of Jester hat, Dr. Zeus Cat in the Hat hat, Mad Hatter top hat, and no one was doing that stuff. So we started wholesaling. We'd make up a bunch of 20 jeans, put them in a backpack, go down Melrose and see who wanted to buy them. Well, around late 1990, 91, I was doing this sort of Americana type things on jeans. And I'd actually bought what turned out to be a Peter Max bedspread and cut it up, not realizing that it was actually something quite collectible. So I had the hippie line, the American flag stuff, and then the Gulf War broke out. And everyone had patriotic American fever. Couldn't make these jeans quick enough with American flags on it. Then did like an Uncle Sam style top hat, just having fun, creative stuff. But what happened was I'd gone from sort of sewing the stuff myself with my then girlfriend to, you know, making 5 pairs of jeans, 10 pairs of jeans, and renting a booth for $10 a day during the week, to all of a sudden couldn't make them quick enough. So then we started hiring people to put patches on the jeans. We'd pay $5 to patch them, $5 to sew them. Probably bought the jeans for a couple of bucks, and then, you know, you're selling them for 30, 40, 50 bucks. So cash started rolling in pretty quick. So that was like the entrepreneurship lesson 101. So sort of right place, right time with a good idea that hadn't been done, and tweaked and worked at it and finalized it, and then started wholesaling. So Gulf War, Americana, people are buying Stars and Stripes stuff. We did a trade show in London, trade show in New York. First trade show we'd ever done at the Javits Center, probably 1991. We got an order from Disneyland, first show. Couldn't believe it. They bought like 10 styles of each hat, and they were buying 144 pieces. So all of a sudden, we had to find a hat manufacturer. Then, of course, once Disneyland bought them, then all of a sudden, Six Flags Magic Mountain's buying them. Then Universal Studios theme parks buying them. So all of a sudden, we've gone from sort of making really no money, living on someone else's apartment floor, to rented a former garage for $200 and set up our own little sewing factory.
And you have no formal business education, but this...
No, I left school at 15. I left school at Silverdale High School at the end of the 5th year. So,
but it seems like this stuff comes natural to you.
Yeah, I think it sort of does. You know, I often talk about this is the type of stuff you can't teach. It's street smarts, it's survival tactic. But it's also knowing an opportunity, but more importantly, doing what you love to do. It's not so much an opportunity, because fast forward 30 odd years later, I've really done 3 things in America. Started a clothing company that became relatively successful and had a good run for at least a dozen years, which enabled us to buy a building in a once former desolate neighborhood that we converted, my wife and I, Karen, who I've been with for 21 years. People thought we were crazy when we bought that building. 26,000 square feet, 2-story brick, built in 1902. So for LA, that's an old building. Right. But back then, the neighborhood was transient and desolate. You know, to back up my story, when I was doing the clothing thing, I was living in Venice. As the clothing became more successful and needed a bigger building, it was hard to get anything done in Venice because all the garment manufacturing was done in downtown LA. And LA's New York's major fashion city, but LA's also a major fashion city on the West Coast. So it necessitated a move to downtown, rented a warehouse, and ended up living in another loft in downtown. So for the next 6 years, the clothing business grew, and we started selling. We sort of changed our style a little bit because, of course, that trend got swamped, and all of a sudden people were knocking us off and making similar type of stuff in China for a third of the price. So we had a great run for probably 2-3 years, and then what we used to sell Disneyland, let's say, for $20 wholesale, they were now retailing that for $20 and buying it from some vendor that had got it made in China and sold it to them for $7 or something. So we formed Serious Clothing in 1994. Before that, it was called Venetian Paradise, little startup business out of my flat in Venice, hence Venetian. At the time, I'm 20, early 20s. It was just like paradise. Living on the beach, making some cash, doing whatever you want. So we needed to separate, you know, in essence, Venetian Paradise had become old hat. We were making these hats that were sort of out of style now. You know, it just exploded beyond this cool little hippie thing into a whole big floppy rave thing, and then all the rappers wearing the big hats, and you know, so we needed to change new identity.
Right.
So
Fashion business must be tough to stay on top of.
Yeah, you know, 15 years later, I'll tell you why we got out of it. But yeah, it's always same but different. People, you know, they don't want to be the first to try something new, but they want something different. So it's constantly reinventing the wheel. You know, and after 15 years, I jokingly refer to it as we got sick of designing a three-legged pant type of thing. Right. So in 94, we changed the name. Someone said, wow, that's some serious shit you got there. And we go, oh, serious, that's a great name for a label. So had this label called Serious, which was full-on cut and sew rock and roll stuff. And we'd started selling this chain called Hot Topic when they had 5 stores. And Hot Topic's like a junior retailer that grew to 700 stores and was in every single mall. And they catered to the misfit teenager, which is always around. It's been around since day one. And that kid just keeps reinventing. But they're always into the same type of genre of goth music, punk rock music, heavy metal music, rebellious teenagers. They're going to be around forever. So that was a core customer. And Hot Topic, we used to do hundreds of thousands of units with those guys. So the business grew to where it became pretty successful, which enabled us to buy the building I described, the 26,000 square foot building in 2000. At the time, people thought we were crazy for doing that. Why would you want to do that?
Because nobody was moving in residential. Nobody
Not
was
really.
making...
I mean, there were the hardcore artist lofts that had been there, that people rented, that were one step above a squat, but people weren't really, or people like us weren't really buying buildings.
Right, and this is a crucial part of your story, is this...
Real pivotal part to the story.
This physical structure, because, you know, it went into kind of the location in the movie business, but also it was a place that you later would be your garage. And
yeah, it happened by accident. I use the word organic quite a lot. You know, it got to the point where from 94 to 2000, we were renting a 5,600 square foot warehouse in the garment district in downtown. And we're also renting a 3,500 square foot loft in the artist district. And after 6 years, we're like, wow, why are we paying 2 people's mortgages? You know, it made no sense. So the business was making money, and we were able to get a bank loan, and we bought this building. And at the time, we'd never owned anything. So buying a building is a real mature purchase. And we're like, wow, how are we going to be able to afford this? And we bought it in 2000 and moved in. We probably spent 12 months building it out. And our goal was to build our dream live workspace, live upstairs, work downstairs. So myself and my wife and 2 cats lived in a 12,000 square foot loft that we built out as our dream live workspace. And I often jokingly refer to it as like a mini Hertz castle. It was a combination of sort of English Gothic meets Moroccan. And we'd always sort of been into, the loft we had before was pretty big, so we'd always go to flea markets such as the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, and we'd go there with a pocket full of cash and an empty van and come back with this mishmash of Middle Eastern, Moroccan, boutique type of furniture. So the loft was a combination of that side mixed with 60s pop art, mid-century modern, which sort of sounds like the two don't go together. But in reality, we created our dream live workspace, and we moved in, I guess, early 2001. But the pivotal point to the story now happens in right after 9/11. I think it was like September 20th, or 2-3 weeks after 9/11. There was an article in the LA Times Sunday Color Supplement magazine, and they were doing a feature on the sort of first wave of adaptive reuse of former industrial buildings, gentrification of the downtown area. Because downtown LA had sort of sat dormant from the 70s all the way through, believe it or not, until mid-90s, late 90s, early 2000s. Nothing was really, I talk about in one of my videos that downtown LA at night time's a ghost town. No one's there, or no one was there, because no one lived downtown. Everyone sort of commuted in and then left. So, you know, the loft was featured in this Sunday Times color supplement, big double center page spread, and literally within 2 weeks, phone rang. It was a location company asking, would we be interested in renting the loft for a music video? Now, bear in mind, we'd lived in downtown since 94, but we'd never owned anything. So we'd seen them shoot everything, Batman, Terminator, Gone in 60 Seconds, and in the 90s, we'd be going out a lot. We were sort of the Hollywood rock and roll couple, going to punk rock shows and heavy metal shows all the time. And we'd be coming back from clubs at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday night, and the street would be closed because they're filming a scene out of Batman. But it never occurred to us we could make money. It just never even occurred to us because we didn't own anything at the time. So when someone said, would you be interested in renting your loft for a music video? Sure, how bad could that be? Well, the very first thing we ever did was a Missy Elliott video with an artist called Tweet. And we're naive. We figure what goes around comes around. We gave an inch and they took 5 miles. And I'll never forget this day because it was the best crash course into the film location business. So we got a fee, and the fee was pretty fat because back then locations paid a lot of money. And it was for a 14-hour day. And the day started at 6 a.m. So 14 hours, they were done by 10 p.m. at night. But halfway through the day, they said, hey, can we just shoot a scene in your office downstairs? I'm like, sure, why not? You're already here. Well, 3 hours later, I'm like, who are these 30 extra people? And one of the location guys goes, oh, nobody told you? We're shooting a Verizon cell phone tie-in with the artist on the back end of the video. Didn't realize we could actually have got more money for that. No one told us that. Then they said, can we shoot a little nightclub scene in your garage? Because they're trying to cram everything into one day so they don't have to go into another location. So I ended up having to move a few cars out of the garage and shot a nightclub scene there. And I think by midnight, I was sort of over it because that was 2 hours into overtime. By 2 a.m., I'm just furious. I'm hating it. I'm like, want to go to bed. I'm tired. Finally, I think we kicked him out around 3 or 4-ish. And so this was, I didn't know what a site rep was, so I'm the guy doing the site rep position, which in essence is making sure these guys are not fucking anything up and burning the building down. So I'd been up literally 22 hours. Started at 6 a.m. on a Friday, ended about 4 a.m. on a Saturday. And we were like, fuck, we'll never do that again. Like, my eyes were tired, my wife was pissed off. Anyway, dust settled 2-3 days later when we realized how much money we'd made in overtime because they went into double time. We were like, wow, I guess we'll do that again. So over the next couple of years, we lived in the building and were selective about what filming we did because the novelty of having to wait for the production company to end or having them rent us a hotel for the night, that novelty wore off. But the big organic turning point happened in 2004, a little over 10 years ago, when we shot this Bruce Willis movie called The Whole 10 Yards. And they were there in the building for a month, relocated us to a house in the Hollywood Hills and paid us quite a lot of money. And finally the light bulb flashed us to, literally it was this simple. Wow, I bet if we didn't live here, we could film all the time. So we got into the film business by accident through that article in the LA Times almost 15 years ago. And we now average probably 80 to 100 days a year of filming. So it's everything from, at one time we'd do 2 reality shows a year for a period of about 5 years because reality shows and lofts were like a match made in heaven. So we did America's Next Top Model and all their spin-off Pussycat Dolls type of shows and The Contender because we had a lot of different looks. We became the one-stop shop look where if it was reality show, the contestants would live upstairs and they'd have all the Video Village control room production office downstairs. So once you got in that loop, we got listed with 5 or 6 agents, and we'd do everything from little still shoots to big budget crime drama TV shows, all the sort of CSI, NCIS, 24, Monk, all that type of stuff. And then we also did tons of commercials, everything from fast food, cell phone, McDonald's, alcohol, party scene, Bud Light commercials, music videos. So that sort of enabled us to really, over the next couple of years, back out of the clothing industry. You know, by this time, we've moved out of the building. We ended up buying another loft around the corner right in 2006. And then probably from 2004 to probably 2010, we just started losing momentum with the clothing industry. I spoke earlier on about how we'd go out and see all these rock and roll bands. We always said we only designed what we personally liked to wear. We didn't follow a trend. We sort of made the trend. So less we started going out, you know, we sort of lost connection with our core audience. We were no longer teenagers. By now we're in our late 30s, but we're still into music, but weren't going out. You know, priorities had changed. So sales started dwindling and it was affecting the business. And finally, you know, it got to the point where we literally said, why are we doing this? You know, the film industry had been pretty good to us. The film revenue is really pretty lucrative because unlike clothing, you don't have to keep redesigning a product. You just maintain the building, maybe change a few things around, buy some furniture, paint some walls. And we were this one-stop shop with a lot of different looks under one roof. So the filming sort of gave us this ability to scale back on the clothing.
remember you said when you stopped the clothing business, it was like pulling a Band-Aid off, and it was hard at first, but then you could kind of let your mind open up.
Yeah, I mean, in reality, we'd sort